Do you ever feel overwhelmed by how complicated cheese making seems to be? I definitely did, until I discovered a few easy, game-changing hacks that instantly made the process faster, simpler, and more reliable. So in this video, I'm going to show you 9 cheese making hacks that will save you a ton of time and help you gain valuable skills so that you can confidently produce delicious cheese without costly mistakes. Oh, it makes me so mad. Let's start with one of the biggest cheese making concerns. Many people worry that they will get sick from their homemade cheeses, and when I first started making it, that was one of my biggest concerns, but I never got sick. I've never even had contamination issues. Unfortunately, that means I don't have examples of contaminated cheeses to show you in my videos, which is kind of a funny thing to complain about. But clearly, my methods work, so what's my method? Besides washing all my equipment with just soap and hot water, I do have one extra step, which involves this simple spray bottle. I learned this trick from a friend who hunts and makes his own sausage at home. To sanitize his workspace, he uses a 50-50 solution of white distilled vinegar and water. When he's working with meat, he sprays this solution twice, waiting 5 minutes between sprays. For cheese making, he says just one spray does the job. So ever since, before making my cheese, I sprayed on all my equipment and workspace with this water vinegar solution as extra insurance against dirt or bacteria. That's it. It's simple, it's effective, it's safe. Now, the fact that I've never had contamination issues might surprise you, especially when you see this next tip. It's a crucial hack that will help you get a handle on cheese making. Quite literally. I stir my cheese with my hand instead of a spoon, and I recommend that you do too, and here's why. First, it's easier. There's no extra dishes to mess with. Second, it's cleaner. With a spoon, you have to think about where you put it down and whether or not something touched it. Your hand is simple. Just soap it up, rinse it off, and you're good to go. Plus, no one's accidentally going to grab your hand to stir a pot of soup while you're working. Third, and most important, stirring with your hand allows you to feel the cheese. You can scrape the bottom of the pot with it to make sure that the curds aren't sticking or that they're not drying out. You can tell if the curds are knitting together or if they're floating free. You can detect whether or not they're well cooked or if they're still fairly raw. Your hand gives you immediate feedback, so use it. Fourth, traditional cheesemakers the world over use their hands when they're making cheese. The ew factor that many of us feel when we think about using our hands is a direct result of how we are divorced from our food supply. So to truly understand and respect and appreciate our food, we need to move past that fear. If you're struggling with the idea of using your hand to make cheese, take baby steps. Heat up a small amount of milk, add a bit of rennet, and then once it's set up, stir that with your hands. And then when you're done, toss it, just throw it out. Do this a few times and soon stirring the cheese with your hand will begin to feel more natural. Of course, if you prefer to stir cheese with a spoon, that's completely fine. You will still make wonderful, delicious cheeses. But using your hand is easier. Hack number 3. This has been instrumental in helping me understand cheese making at a deeper level. It's given me confidence in the process and in my own abilities. Whenever you can, switch from using freeze-dried cultures to natural cultures. There are 5 main natural cultures: whey from cheese making, yogurt, kefir, cultured buttermilk, and clabber. Now, cheeses fall into 2 categories. There are thermophilic cheeses, which are higher temperature, generally about 100 degrees and above, and there are mesophilic cheeses, which are lower temperature cheeses, like 100 degrees and below that. As a general rule, you want to match the cheese with its culture type. So for example, thermophilic cultures are used to make thermophilic cheeses, and mesophilic cultures are used to make mesophilic cheeses. Thermophilic cultures include yogurt because it's been incubated at about 110 degrees, whey from thermophilic cheeses, clabber that has been cultured at higher temperatures. Likewise, mesophilic cultures are used to make mesophilic cheeses, and they include kefir, cultured buttermilk, whey for making other mesophilic cheeses, and clabber that has been cultured at room temperature. Now that said, I do bend these rules a lot. I use clabber to culture almost all my cheeses, whether or not they're mesophilic or thermophilic. And I have a friend who uses yogurt to culture almost all her cheeses, and yogurt is a thermophilic culture. So, experiment. There is room for playing around here. A few other important tips. If you're using leftover whey as your culture, keep it fresh. You want to use it probably within 24 to 48 hours after making a batch of cheese. All these cultures can be frozen, and the general rule of thumb is 1/4 cup of a natural culture per gallon of milk. You can scale this up So if you're using, say, 8 gallons of milk to make a cheese, that would be 2 cups of your natural culture. Now, this next hack might sound a little bit silly, but it's incredibly helpful, especially if you're short on space. Use your bathtub as an extension of your kitchen. I use mine for washing my large cheese pots, for hand washing my cheesecloths, even for incubating yogurt. When I'm doing yogurt, I place the jars inside a cooler and then I set the whole cooler in the tub, close the shower curtain, and it's so out of sight, I almost forget it's there. So your bathtub can absorb a lot of the overflow that comes from cheese making. So, make good use of it. Now, as a home cheesemaker who deals with the daily influx of milk, I'm always looking for ways to scale up my cheese making in order to streamline my tasks. And this next hack has allowed me to make more cheese without needing to make more batches or spend money on buying bigger molds. When I started making cheese, something I quickly noticed was that the curds always sink a fair bit in the mold during pressing. So a mold that's packed full at the beginning will only be about halfway full at the end of pressing, which seemed like such a waste of space to me. I wanted to fit more curds into the mold, but how? And then I came up with a simple solution. I placed a couple sheets of plastic mesh inside the mold so that they extended above the mold's rim to create a taller collar. Then I placed cheesecloth inside, clipping it to the mesh with clothespins to hold it in place. Once I did that, I could pack curds well above the mold's original height. And as the curds settled during pressing, they would sink down until they were level with the mold or below, at which point I can remove the collar and continue pressing as usual. Sometimes though, I do get a little greedy and overfill it, but oops. Now, if you've been making cheese for any amount of time, you know that there are so many moving parts. You're constantly thinking about next steps and contingency plans. So this next hack saves you brain energy and helps your cheese making become a little bit more intuitive. When I first started making cheese, I carefully followed the exact pressing weights and times. But I soon realized that all that precision and fiddling wasn't necessary. And over time, I've developed a simpler, more intuitive approach to pressing cheese. So these are my notes, and I hope it will help you become a little bit more at ease with pressing cheese. Start pressing gently and then gradually increase pressing over time. Don't press so hard that you break down the curds and express the cream in the milk. The whey that is draining out from the mold should look similar to the whey that was in the cheese pot. More weight and a longer pressing time will create a cheese that is more dense. Conversely, softer, moister cheeses require a shorter pressing time and less weight. Cheeses like cheddar that are salted and milled before pressing require more pressure and sometimes really intense pressure in order for the curds to knit together and form a smooth rind. It's really important that cheeses that are going to have a natural rind or be bandage wrapped have a smooth surface on the cheese because molds love to go into those cracks and grow. So don't natural rind cracked cheeses. Cheeses that are cooked to a higher temperature tend to stick to the cheesecloth more easily. So it's really important that you flip these cheeses frequently, especially at the beginning. So the bottom line is don't worry too much about pressing times and weights. Just have a general idea of the texture that you're going for and the kind of cheese that you're making, and then adjust your pressure and times accordingly. Now, this next hack solves something that really stumped me at first. Some recipes, like the Toscano pepato, which is a high temperature cheese, require that the cheese stay warm during pressing. But how do you keep a whole cheese warm, especially with the big bulky press and all the whey that's making a mess everywhere? And then I realized if I remove the racks from my oven, the press could fit inside my oven perfectly. I could set the oven to proofing temps and then keep my cheese warm while pressing. Now, if you have a really large cooler, which I don't have, but some of you might, then you could also take your press and set it into your cooler and put a couple of jars of really hot water in there, and that would also keep your cheese warm while pressing. Now, this next hack saves so much time and it prevents the texture of your cheese from being compromised during brining. When I started cheese making, I wasn't sure about the rules of brining or maintaining a brine. It just made me a little bit nervous to keep reusing it for different cheeses. But now I've been brining cheeses for years and I've developed a few special tricks. First, keep it salty. While brining, a cheese will absorb the salt from the brine, so over time your brine will become less salty. Therefore, it is important to keep a large amount of salt in the brine at all times. So after brining, just dump in some more salt. As long as there is like an inch of salt sludge at the bottom of your jar, then you're good to go. It's saturated. During brining, the whey from the cheese is naturally sucked into the brine. just like the salt from the brine is sucked into the cheese. That whey contains calcium. And it's really important that the brine has calcium so that it does not suck the calcium out of the cheese. If your brine does not have calcium in it, the texture of your cheese will become compromised. It will become mushy. When you first make a brine, you put a little bit of calcium chloride in it. But over time, that natural movement of whey into the brine means that your brine becomes very calcium rich, very sturdy, very strong. It's a really good home for your cheeses. Now, because the brine is sucking the whey out of the cheese during brining, you will notice that you have more brine at the end of brining a cheese than you did at the beginning. So when you go to dump your brine back into your gallon jar or whatever container you're storing it in, you will notice that it doesn't all fit. Don't worry about it. Just tip the extra down the drain, make sure you have enough salt in your brine, and carry on. When your brine is not in use, you need to store it either in the refrigerator or at cheese cave temperatures. While I am brining a cheese, I don't even bother washing the brine jar. I just let it sit on the counter with the salt sludge that's at the bottom. When I'm done brining the cheese, I just dump it all back in and put everything away. If your brine ever gets messy, like there's lots of floating bits in it from, say, a spiced cheese that you had, you can strain the brine, boil it, add more salt so it's saturated, and then put it back in the jar. That's how you can keep it going. But the truth is, boiling a brine is really messy. It leaves salt stains everywhere, and it's just really not worth the time. So if my brines ever get really messy, I tend to just throw them out. But normally I keep a single brine going for, I don't know, 6 months, 12 months longer. And a few floaties here and there aren't gonna hurt your cheeses at all. And that's the other thing. I used to always worry that if I brined a blue cheese, that would contaminate other cheeses that I would brine later. That is not true. Penicillium roquefort 40 cannot survive in a saturated salt brine. So you can brine a blue cheese and then you can brine a Colby and it will all be fine. One more thing to be aware of, if you're making a brine with whey instead of water, let the whey culture at room temperature for 1 to 2 days before adding salt. And know that whey is acidic and calcium rich, so you won't need to add vinegar or calcium chloride to your whey-based brine. So make your brine once, reuse it indefinitely, and it will get stronger and better over time. Many of you have told me that you struggle to find a good aging space for your cheese. And finding an aging space can be so tricky. We have a downstairs guest room that doubles as a storage space. And since our house is heated by a wood stove, over the winter months, the rooms that are closed off from the main part of the house get pretty cold. So over the winter, I've taken to closing the door to the downstairs bedroom and using that space that is now cold as an extra place to age my cheeses. As the weather warms, I open the windows during the night and then shut them during the day, which kind of keeps the room a little bit cooler to stretch out that amount of time. It's not a perfect situation, but it does give me some much needed space for aging, and it's accessible. It's close to the kitchen and I kind of like using that space. Now, if you want more ideas for creating aging spaces for your cheeses, I've put together a free resource that includes a whole section on aging cheeses and tips for setting up your own cheese cave. You can find the link at the description below. Also, exciting news, we are currently building a walk-in cheese cave or a cool room or whatever you want to call it. Once it's ready, I'm going to make a full video detailing the whole process so that you can learn from our successes or failures. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that one. And in the meantime, if you've discovered any cheese making hacks, I'd love it if you drop them in the comments. I'm always looking for ways to simplify my process, and I'm sure others are too. And now, if you want another easy way to level up your cheese making, watch this next video about how to reduce waste and get more cheese from your milk.